He inherited a cabin hanging off the edge of a cliff, a place no one in town wanted to talk about. They said his grandmother didn't live there. She was guarding something beneath it. The first night, his German shepherd didn't sleep. It clawed at the floor, like it knew what was hidden below. When he broke through, he found a tunnel, carved by someone else long before him. Inside, the crystals lit up the cave, but the drill marks on the walls told a different story. Days later, strangers arrived. They didn't ask about the cabin. They asked what was under it. Then the rock began to crack, and deep below, he found a hollow space holding the entire cliff together. And when it started to collapse, his dog had to choose who to save. Stay with me, this isn't about what he found. It's about what he chose to leave buried. The wind moved slowly along the face of the cliff, carrying the faint scent of pine and cold stone. Evening light stretched thin across the rocks, and the old wooden cabin stood at the edge as if it had grown from the cliff itself, weathered but unyielding. Ethan Brooks stepped out of his aging pickup truck and looked up at the cabin his grandmother had left him. At 47, he carried himself like a man who had learned discipline before comfort. Broad shoulders, squared jaw, faint lines etched permanently at the corners of his hazel-brown eyes. His hair was short, hazel with streaks of gray at the temples, and his sun-tanned skin told the story of long years outdoors. He wore a forest green and black plaid flannel jacket against the chill, black jeans worn soft at the knees, and low brown leather shoes dusted with gravel from the climb. People in town had stopped asking him questions after the funeral, not because they weren't curious, but because they weren't comfortable. They said the cabin sat on forgotten land, a section that had been marked unstable decades ago and quietly ignored by surveyors. They said his grandmother hadn't simply lived there, she had guarded something. Ethan didn't believe in rumors. He believed in structures, in foundations, in what could be seen and measured. War had stripped him of superstition years ago. Still, as he walked up the uneven steps, he felt something unsettled under his ribs, like the faint vibration of distant artillery that never fully left a soldier's body. Beside him moved Ranger, his German shepherd. The dog was large, athletic, with a black saddle across his back and rich tan along his legs and face. His amber-brown eyes were alert but calm, ears upright, and constantly scanning. Ranger was 5 years old enough to be steady, young enough to still move like coiled muscle. Ethan had adopted him 2 years earlier after returning home from his final deployment. Ranger had once belonged to another veteran who never made it back. That history lived quietly in the way the dog stayed close, without needing command. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of cedar and stone dust. The structure leaned slightly toward the cliff edge, not dangerously, but enough to remind Ethan that the earth beneath it wasn't ordinary soil. The floorboards creaked under his weight. He walked from room to room, running his fingers along shelves, checking window latches, inspecting joints where wood met stone. His mind calmed when he measured things. Angles, stress points, load distribution. His grandmother, Margaret Brooks, had been a small woman with iron-gray hair, usually tied into a loose knot at the base of her neck. She had stood barely 5 feet tall, but there had been something unyielding in her spine, as if she refused to bend to wind or opinion. Her skin had been lined from decades of mountain air, her blue eyes sharp and unflinching. She rarely laughed loudly. When she did, it was brief and precise, like she allowed herself only measured joy. Ethan remembered her hands most clearly calloused, steady, capable of lifting more than her size suggested. She had once told him, "Some places don't need protecting from people. They need protecting from what people become." He hadn't understood then. By nightfall, the temperature dropped further. Ethan lit a small fire in the cast-iron stove and sat on the wooden bench near the window. Ranger lay at his feet at first, breathing slow and even. The wind pressed against the cabin walls in long sighs. Then Ranger lifted his head. Ethan didn't react immediately. Dogs adjusted to new environments all the time. But Ranger didn't bark. He didn't growl. He stood and walked toward the center of the living room floor, nose low, ears forward. He sniffed once, twice, then he scratched. Not playfully, deliberately. The sound of claws against wood cut through the quiet. Ethan rose and stepped closer. "Easy," he murmured, but Ranger ignored him. The dog scratched again, harder this time, then stopped and looked up directly into Ethan's eyes. Not anxious, not afraid, focused. Ethan knelt and placed his palm flat against the floorboards. They felt solid enough. Old, but reinforced. He pressed harder. Nothing obvious shifted. Ranger scratched again, slightly to the left of the first mark. "All right," Ethan said quietly. He walked to the tool chest he had brought in earlier and retrieved a hammer. He tapped the floor where Ranger had indicated. The sound echoed differently than he expected. Not the dull thud of wood over earth. A sharper, hollow resonance. He moved a few inches to the right and tapped again. Another hollow note. Not one void. Several. Ethan's jaw tightened. Structures were predictable. If there was space beneath, there had to be reason. A crawl space, perhaps. Storage. But the echo suggested depth beyond simple utility. He tapped farther outward. The sound shifted back to solid density. He returned to the first spot. Tap. Hollow. He followed the pattern across the boards, mapping the invisible shape beneath like tracing a wound under skin. It was larger than he first thought. Ranger lowered himself and placed his ear against the floor. The dog remained still, listening. After several seconds, he stood abruptly and stepped back, not retreating in fear, but yielding space, as if allowing Ethan to continue. Ethan ran a hand over his face. A flicker of something old stirred in him, not fear, but awareness. The kind that had once told him when terrain ahead was wrong, when silence meant preparation rather than peace. He thought of Margaret's words. Some places don't need protecting from people. They need protecting from what people become. Why build a cabin over empty space? Why reinforce the beams so carefully? Why never mention it in her letters? He stood and fetched a pry bar. Ranger stepped aside but did not look away. Ethan slid the metal edge between two boards and applied steady pressure. The wood resisted at first, then gave with a long, reluctant groan. Dust rose into the air as he lifted one plank. Darkness opened beneath. Cool air drifted upward, carrying a faint metallic scent. Not soil, not rot. Stone. Ethan angled a flashlight into the gap. The beam fell not on dirt, but on cut edges. Clean. Deliberate. This wasn't a natural hollow. It was a constructed entrance. He widened the opening enough to see further down. The light revealed a descending slope, carved into rock, disappearing into shadow. Behind him, Ranger let out a low sound, not a growl, not a whine, something between anticipation and warning. Ethan swallowed slowly. His heartbeat steadied, rather than quickened. Whatever lay beneath this cabin was not an accident. His grandmother had known. She had built above it intentionally. Guarded it. Reinforced it. The town had said she was protecting something. Standing over the open floor, cold air brushing his face, Ethan realized one thing with absolute certainty. Beneath the cabin was not just a storage space. It was a passage, and whatever waited below had been hidden on purpose. He lowered the flashlight deeper. The beam vanished into blackness that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. Ranger stepped closer again, positioning himself between Ethan and the open gap, as if already prepared to follow him down. Ethan stared into the darkness, feeling that old, familiar awareness, return the sense that, once you stepped forward, there was no simple way back. Above them, the cabin stood silent against the cliff, as if it had been waiting for this moment. And for the first time since arriving, Ethan understood that the cabin had never been abandoned. It had been sealed. Something lay beneath it, and it was not just empty space. Ethan did not sleep. He covered the opening with a heavy table and placed 2 iron chairs on top, more out of instinct than logic. Ranger lay beside the makeshift barrier, not resting, not pacing, simply watching. The cabin groaned softly in the night wind, but the sound from below was different. It was absence, a depth that absorbed the world above it. At dawn, Ethan moved the furniture aside. The morning light was pale and thin against the cliff face, but steady enough to show him the dust patterns around the opened boards. Nothing had shifted overnight. Whatever lay below had been waiting longer than a single night. He dressed without hesitation. The air was still cold enough to keep the forest green and black plaid flannel jacket on his shoulders. His movements were precise, controlled. Ranger stood as soon as Ethan did, stretching once before, positioning himself at the edge of the opening. Ethan lowered himself carefully, boots finding carved steps rather than loose rock. That was the first confirmation. This was not a natural fissure. Someone had cut into the cliff with intention. The stone edges were clean in places, beveled slightly where tools had smoothed them. The slope descended at a consistent angle, engineered rather than accidental. Ranger moved ahead but never too far. Every few feet he paused, ears forward, head tilted as if measuring something beyond sound. Ethan noticed the walls bore faint horizontal scoring, long shallow lines repeating at even intervals, not chisel marks. Circular, the pattern of rotary drilling. He crouched and brushed his fingers across the grooves. They were old. The edges had dulled from time and mineral seepage, but the pattern was unmistakable. He continued downward. The temperature dropped noticeably. The scent shifted from dry cedar to mineral and metal. The passage widened gradually until the narrow tunnel opened into a cavern large enough to swallow the cabin above it. Ethan stopped at the threshold. The beam from his flashlight struck the far wall and exploded into light. Crystals rose from the rock in jagged formations, some as tall as a man. Clear quartz with veins of milky opacity running through them like frozen lightning. When the beam moved, the entire chamber shimmered, reflections multiplying across faceted surfaces. It was not merely beautiful, it was disorienting. The light fractured into fragments, turning shadow into moving geometry. Ranger did not appear impressed. He stepped cautiously into the cavern, paws placing carefully on uneven stone. He sniffed at the base of a crystal cluster, then shifted his focus toward the left wall where the rock texture changed. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. The crystal growth there had been interrupted. A section of wall bore deeper cuts, more aggressive scoring. The marks overlapped in a way that suggested repeated attempts. Someone had drilled here multiple times, each time adjusting angle and depth. Ethan approached slowly. He examined the rock face, tracing the circular impressions with the flashlight. Some holes had been filled with mineral deposits, suggesting years had passed. Others appeared less weathered. He knelt and examined the debris at the base. Not natural collapse. Broken drill bits, perhaps. He found a small shard of metal embedded in stone, oxidized but still recognizable as part of a cutting edge. Not hers, he said quietly to Ranger. Margaret had been meticulous but not industrial. She would not have used this kind of equipment. She would not have left fragments behind. Ethan's gaze moved upward. Above the drill scars, the ceiling of the cavern arched into shadow. He angled the beam higher and saw faint stress lines branching outward like cracks in glass, barely visible unless the light struck them directly. They were subtle but present. This space was not just hollow, it was structural, load-bearing in ways that were not immediately obvious. He walked slowly around the perimeter of the chamber. The floor was uneven, but stable. Along one side he discovered wooden supports, long, rotted, and collapsed. They had once reinforced a narrower passage that had since caved inward. Whoever had come here before had not been amateurs. They had planned extraction. They had reinforced where they believed weakness might form. And they had either failed or fled. Ranger froze suddenly. His body stiffened, tail low but not tucked. Ethan followed his line of sight toward the far edge of the cavern. There, half hidden behind a column of quartz, was a piece of equipment too modern to belong to Margaret's time. A portable drilling rig, compact but heavy, coated in dust. The battery housing was cracked. The cable lay severed cleanly, not frayed. Ethan stepped closer. He brushed aside the dust with his sleeve. The model number was still legible. It was not ancient. Perhaps 5, maybe 8 years old. Not decades. Which meant someone had been here recently. He crouched beside it and examined the ground. There were faint boot impressions preserved in mineral residue. Larger than his own, with a tread pattern consistent with industrial work boots. He measured one against his hand. Broad. Likely a man over 6 feet. Heavy build. Ethan stood and turned slowly, scanning the cavern anew. The silence felt different now. Not untouched. Interrupted. He imagined men working here under artificial lights, the whine of drills echoing through the chamber, the false confidence that comes from believing rock is passive. He had seen that look before in younger soldiers who believed terrain would always yield to force. It rarely did. Ranger padded back to his side and pressed lightly against Ethan's leg. The dog's breathing was steady, but alert. Ethan placed a hand on Ranger's head, feeling the warmth of living muscle against cold air. "We're not the first," he murmured. He stepped toward the far wall where the most aggressive drilling had occurred. The holes had been driven deep, then abandoned. He inserted the flashlight beam into one of the cavities. The light did not reflect as expected. It vanished into a darker void beyond the crystal layer. Ethan adjusted his angle. There was space behind the crystal growth. Not just stone. A hollow beyond the visible chamber. His pulse slowed. Not from calm, but from focus. The stress lines on the ceiling aligned with the drilled section. Whoever had been here had not understood the structural balance of the formation. Remove the wrong section, and the load would redistribute violently. He moved back several steps and looked upward again. The subtle fractures traced outward like warning veins. Ranger's ears twitched sharply. He turned his head toward the tunnel entrance. Ethan listened. At first there was nothing. Then, faintly, a vibration. Not from within the cavern, from above. Distant but rhythmic. Vehicle tires on gravel. Ethan extinguished the flashlight immediately. Darkness swallowed the chamber. Only the faint natural glimmer of quartz remained, absorbing what little ambient light filtered down from the tunnel. He waited. The vibration grew slightly stronger, then stopped. A car door closing echoed faintly from the direction of the cabin above. Ranger let out the lowest possible rumble in his chest. Not loud enough to carry, just enough to communicate. Ethan's jaw tightened. Someone had come up the cliff road. Not a common visit. Not accidental. He glanced once more at the drilled wall and the hollow beyond it. Whoever had tried to extract from here had either miscalculated or been interrupted. The equipment left behind suggested haste or danger. He placed a hand against the cool crystal surface. Beneath it, unseen, was a space deeper than this cavern, a void that did not belong to human plans. The vibration above came again, softer now, as if someone were walking across the cabin floor. Ethan understood something with absolute clarity. The tunnel had not been built by his grandmother, and whoever had built it had not finished what they started. He turned toward the passage leading back up, Ranger already moving ahead of him. Above them, the cabin waited. And it was no longer empty. Ethan emerged from the tunnel into the cabin, with Ranger close at his heels, every sense sharpened. The interior felt different now, as though the wood itself were listening. Morning light cut across the floorboards in pale strips, illuminating dust in the air. Near the window stood a man Ethan had never seen before. He was tall, easily 6'2", with broad shoulders that filled the doorway as if he belonged to larger spaces. His beard was trimmed but thick along the jaw, dark brown threaded with premature gray. His nose had been broken at least once, giving his profile a slight curve. He wore a heavy canvas work jacket and steel-toed boots, scuffed and coated with dried mineral dust. His eyes were not hostile, but calculating. The man raised both hands slowly. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said. His voice was low, controlled, used to giving instructions. "Name's Daniel Mercer." Ethan did not answer immediately. Ranger stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Ethan and Mercer without baring teeth, simply claiming space. Mercer noticed the dog first. "Good animal," he remarked. "Knows when something's wrong." "What are you doing in my cabin?" Ethan asked evenly. Mercer's gaze drifted toward the open floorboards before returning to Ethan's face. "You've already found it," he said quietly. "I was wondering how long it would take." Ethan's posture remained rigid. "Found what?" Mercer gave a small, humorless smile. "The part she never told you about." The name was unspoken but obvious. Margaret. Before Ethan could respond, a second figure stepped into view behind Mercer. She was shorter, lean, with shoulder-length ash-blonde hair tucked behind one ear. Her skin was pale from long hours indoors, and thin rectangular glasses rested on a sharp nose. She wore a dark field jacket and carried a leather satchel slung across her body. There was a tension in her posture, not fear, but discomfort. She did not belong to heavy equipment and drills. She belonged to books. "This is Dr. Sarah Whitaker," Mercer said. "Geologist." Sarah gave Ethan a brief nod. Her eyes were intelligent, observant, but unsettled by the confrontation. "We didn't break in to steal anything," she said quickly. "We came to confirm structural readings." "Readings from what?" Ethan asked. Sarah hesitated before answering. "From beneath the cliff. There's a void under the quartz chamber. A massive load-bearing cavity. Your grandmother discovered it decades ago." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You knew her?" Sarah shook her head. "I studied the collapse report. 30 years ago, a small independent mining crew attempted extraction here. They destabilized the interior support. One man died. The rest covered it up because they weren't licensed." Mercer's expression darkened. "My uncle was part of that crew," he said. "He was the one buried." The confession shifted the air. Ethan studied Mercer more carefully. The tension in the man's shoulders was not greed alone. It was unfinished history. "She survived," Sarah continued. "Your grandmother. She was hiking near the cliff when the first fracture occurred. She warned them to stop. They didn't listen." Ethan pictured Margaret standing against men twice her size, voice steady, refusing to yield. That image felt true. "She filed a private report," Sarah said, opening her satchel and pulling out photocopied pages. "But the county suppressed it. The cavity beneath the quartz isn't just hollow space. It redistributes the cliff's weight. If you remove the wrong sections, the stress transfers unpredictably." Ethan remembered the stress lines in the cavern ceiling, the subtle fractures spreading outward. "She built over the entrance," Sarah continued softly. "Not to hide a mine, to prevent anyone from reaching the void." Mercer's eyes hardened. "Or to keep it for herself." Ranger gave a low rumble at the change in tone. Ethan held Mercer's gaze. If she wanted it mined, she had 30 years. Mercer did not answer. Instead, he stepped toward the table where Ethan had set aside the removed boards. "You saw the drill rig down there," he said. "That was ours. We came back 5 years ago to retrieve what we couldn't finish. But something shifted. The cavity isn't stable anymore." Sarah's voice cut in. "Because someone drilled too deep." Mercer shot her a look but did not deny it. Ethan felt anger flicker, but it was controlled. "You destabilized it." "We tried to extract only the surface growth," Mercer insisted. "The crystals are valuable, but when we drilled behind the primary cluster, we hit open air. The pressure change nearly collapsed the chamber. Ethan thought of the hollow beyond the drilled wall, the flashlight beam disappearing. Sarah stepped closer now, urgency replacing hesitation. There's a secondary void beneath the first. It's deeper than the quartz chamber. That's what your grandmother meant in her notes. Ethan's eyes sharpened. What notes? Sarah hesitated. Then she removed a small leather-bound notebook from her satchel. It was worn, edges frayed, spine cracked from age. Ethan recognized it instantly. Margaret's handwriting covered the margins. You had this, he said quietly. We found it in county archives, Sarah replied. It was filed under geological anomalies. Your grandmother described the formation as a stone lung. Ethan flipped through the pages. The writing was precise but urgent. Diagrams of cross-sections, annotations in tight script. And there, sketched repeatedly in the margins, was the same symbol Ethan had glimpsed, scratched faintly into the cavern wall, a circle fractured from within. He turned to the final intact page. The rest had been torn out deliberately. A single line remained. If you see the fractures widen, do not stay. Ethan closed the notebook slowly. Why are you here now? Sarah answered first. Because seismic monitors registered microshifts last week. The void is changing. If someone drills again, the redistribution could trigger a cascade failure. Mercer folded his arms. And because what's down there is worth enough to make people reckless. Silence stretched. The cabin creaked softly as wind pressed against the cliff. Ethan looked at Ranger. The dog's posture remained alert but calm, eyes shifting between the strangers and the open floor. Ranger trusted Ethan's stillness. What happens? Ethan asked quietly. If the secondary void collapses? Sarah's expression grew grave. The entire cliff face could shear off. Not immediately, but in segments. Everything built on top would go first. The cabin. Mercer met Ethan's eyes. Including you. Ethan stepped toward the window and looked out at the drop below. Pine trees stretched far beneath the cliff edge, their tops small from this height. He imagined the sound of rock tearing free, the sudden absence of ground. His grandmother had not guarded wealth. She had guarded balance. Ethan turned back to them. You drilled once. You nearly destroyed it. Mercer's jaw flexed. I lost family here. And you almost created more graves, Ethan replied. Sarah stepped between them slightly. This isn't about blame. The fractures are widening. Someone else has started drilling again. Ethan's gaze sharpened. You? Mercer shook his head. Not us. As if on cue, a faint vibration traveled through the floorboards. Subtle, but unmistakable. Ranger's ears snapped upright. Another tremor followed, stronger. Dust fell from the ceiling beams. Sarah's face drained of color. That's not natural settling. Mercer moved toward the opening in the floor. Someone's down there. Ethan felt the weight of the notebook in his hand. The torn pages. The symbol. The warning. He realized the truth had layers. The quartz was only the visible temptation. Beneath it lay a structural lung, a cavity that allowed the cliff to breathe under pressure. If punctured in the wrong place, the entire formation would fail from within. Another vibration rolled through the cabin, sharper this time. A faint cracking sound echoed from below. Ranger let out a short, urgent bark and moved toward the opening, ready to descend. Ethan met Mercer's eyes once more. If anyone drills deeper, he said, they won't just take the crystals. The tremor intensified, followed by the unmistakable sound of rock fracturing in the depths. They'll break the spine of the mountain. The floor shuddered beneath them. And somewhere below the quartz chamber, something shifted. The symbol of the fractured circle suddenly made terrible sense. The tremor faded as suddenly as it had begun, leaving a brittle silence inside the cabin. Dust settled along the beams, and for a moment, no one spoke. Ethan could feel the weight of the cliff pressing downward, as if the mountain itself were listening to what would happen next. Ranger stood rigid near the opening in the floor, his black and tan coat bristling subtly along the spine, amber eyes fixed on the dark below. Daniel Mercer was the first to move. He stepped toward the window and pulled the curtain aside just enough to peer down the gravel road carved into the cliffside. "They didn't come up in our truck," he muttered. "That vibration wasn't from our equipment." His voice had lost its earlier defensiveness. Now it carried tension sharpened by recognition. Dr. Sarah Whitaker adjusted her glasses, pushing them higher along the bridge of her nose as she listened. She had steadied herself quickly after the tremor, though her fingers still tightened around the strap of her satchel. Ethan noticed how she breathed through her nose, measured and deliberate, the way someone trained to manage panic in laboratories where pressure shifts meant disaster. Then came the sound that confirmed everything. A second vehicle engine, lower and heavier than Mercer's truck, idled somewhere just out of sight beyond the cabin. Ranger's ears snapped toward the front door. He released a deep, controlled growl. Not loud but filled with certainty. Ethan moved to the door and opened it slowly. Gravel crunched under unfamiliar boots. 3 men stood several yards from the porch, framed against the pale morning sky. The first was unmistakably the one in charge. He was broad-shouldered but lean, tall, with a rigid posture that suggested military discipline repurposed for other ambitions. His face was angular, cheekbones sharp beneath sun-darkened skin, a thin scar traced from the edge of his left eyebrow down to his temple, pale against the tan. His dark hair was clipped short, nearly shaved at the sides. He wore a fitted charcoal jacket and heavy work boots that carried dust similar to the residue Ethan had seen below. His eyes were calm, assessing, and entirely unhurried. Beside him stood a heavier man, thick through the chest and arms, with a shaved head and a permanent squint that made him appear suspicious even when still. His beard was patchy but dense around the chin, and a faded tattoo crawled up the side of his neck. He shifted his weight often, impatient energy vibrating in him like coiled machinery. The third man was younger, perhaps late 20s, slim and restless. His brown hair fell slightly into his eyes, and he wore gloves despite the mild chill. He avoided direct eye contact, glancing instead at the cabin's foundation, the cliff edge, and the forest below. He looked like someone new to this kind of confrontation, not yet hardened, but eager to appear so. The leader stepped forward. "Morning," he said evenly. His voice was smooth but controlled, the kind that did not need to raise itself to dominate a conversation. "Name's Victor Hale." Ethan remained on the porch, posture straight, flannel jacket dark against the pale wood. "Private property," he replied. Hale's gaze drifted briefly to Ranger, who now stood at Ethan's side, head level, tail steady. The dog did not lunge. He did not bark. He simply stared. "We're aware," Hale said calmly. "We were here years ago, before the structure was reinforced." Mercer stepped out behind Ethan, tension radiating from him. "You drilled too deep," Mercer said bluntly. Hale's eyes flicked to Mercer without surprise. "Daniel," he acknowledged. "I wondered if you'd come back." Sarah remained inside, but close enough to hear. Ethan could sense her unease growing. "You destabilized the primary quartz formation," Mercer continued. "You nearly triggered a collapse." Hale did not deny it. "We miscalculated the depth of the secondary cavity," he replied. "But we didn't finish the job." Ethan's voice cut in. "You won't." Hale studied him now, taking in Ethan's weathered features, the steadiness in his eyes. "You're the grandson," he said. "Margaret's." Ethan did not respond. Hale nodded slightly. "She was stubborn, impressive actually. Tried to convince us the cliff had a structural lung beneath it. Said if we punctured the wrong section, the load redistribution would tear the rock from within." Sarah stepped onto the porch then, her pale face resolute despite the tension. "Because it will," she said firmly. "You've seen the fractures widen. Seismic data doesn't lie." The heavier man snorted. Data doesn't pay for lost investment. Hale raised a hand slightly to silence him. His eyes remained on Ethan. We're not here for the surface crystals anymore. There's something deeper. The word deeper settled like a weight. Ranger's growl deepened, chest vibrating. The younger man instinctively stepped back a half pace. Hale noticed. Control your dog, he said mildly. He is controlled, Ethan answered evenly. For a long moment, no one moved. Wind cut across the cliff face, brushing through the pine tops below. Hale spoke again. Quieter now. The first time we drilled, we thought we hit a simple hollow. We were wrong. It's not just empty space, it's layered. A void beneath a void. And something in that lower chamber is redistributing pressure upward. He paused, studying Ethan carefully. Your grandmother didn't hide a mine. She hid access. Mercer's jaw clenched. Access to what? Hale's eyes narrowed slightly. That's what we intend to finish discovering. Ethan stepped forward until he stood at the edge of the porch, forcing Hale to tilt his head slightly upward to maintain eye contact. You drill again, Ethan said, voice low but steady. And you won't just destabilize a chamber. You'll shear the entire cliff. Hale's expression did not shift, but something in his gaze hardened. We've reinforced our entry point. Sarah shook her head. Reinforcement doesn't matter if you rupture the secondary cavity. Hale's patience thinned. You don't know that. I do, Sarah replied quietly. I've modeled it. Silence again. Hale looked from Sarah to Mercer to Ethan, calculating. Then he gave a small nod to his men. We're not here to argue. We're here to finish what we started. He turned and began walking back toward the trees lining the edge of the clearing. The heavy-set man followed without hesitation. The younger man hesitated a moment longer, glancing once at Ranger's unwavering stare before hurrying after them. Ethan watched as they disappeared toward a second trail that curved downward along the cliff face, hidden from the main road. They have another entry, Mercer said quietly. Sarah exhaled slowly. If they drill from beneath the secondary chamber, they'll puncture the lower cavity directly. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent, then ran to the edge of the cabin where the cliff dropped steeply. He stared downward, body angled forward as if hearing something the humans could not yet detect. A faint metallic echo carried upward from below. Not loud, but rhythmic. Ethan felt it in his boots a second later. A vibration, subtle but growing. They didn't come to talk, Mercer muttered. Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the tree line where Hale had vanished. No, he agreed. They came to finish. Another pulse traveled through the ground, stronger this time. A thin crack traced itself along one of the porch boards near Ethan's feet. Barely visible but undeniable. Sarah's voice was tight now. If that fracture reaches the quartz ceiling, Ethan did not let her finish. He stepped back inside and looked down through the open floor once more. The darkness below seemed different, heavier. Hale had said something deeper existed, not just a chamber, a layered void, and they were already drilling toward it. Ranger turned from the cliff edge and ran back inside, standing beside Ethan as if awaiting instruction. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief second, feeling the mountain's subtle tremor through the soles of his boots. They had been here before. They knew more than they admitted. And they were not leaving. Night fell heavy and windless over the cliff. No branches scraped the cabin walls. No loose shutters rattled. The stillness was almost unnatural, the kind that made small sounds feel magnified. Inside, the stove burned low, casting a dull amber glow across the floorboards. Ethan sat at the edge of the table, flannel jacket still on despite the warmth, listening not with his ears alone but with the quiet instincts that had once kept him alive in foreign terrain. Ranger lay near the open section of floor, not asleep, not restless, simply waiting. The first tremor came softly. Not enough to shift furniture, not enough to scatter ash from the stove. Just a subtle vibration beneath the soles of Ethan's boots. He felt it before he consciously registered it. Ranger lifted his head at the exact same second. Their eyes met. Another pulse followed, shorter, deeper, not from wind, from below. Ranger rose immediately and positioned himself directly in front of the opening to the tunnel, body squared, legs planted. His black saddle fur along the spine bristled, tan muzzle lifted slightly as he inhaled the air rising from the gap. A low growl vibrated from his chest, steady and restrained. Ethan stood slowly. "Easy," he murmured. But Ranger did not move. The sound from beneath was not the grinding slide of rock. It was more rhythmic, hollow, as if a vast chamber were shifting pressure rather than collapsing. Ethan recognized it with unsettling clarity. It resembled the sound of reinforced steel containers adjusting under stress during air transport. A deep, internal contraction. Mercer and Sarah had returned to their truck before dusk, planning to monitor from a distance and regroup in the morning. Ethan had insisted on staying. It was his cabin, his ground. The vibration returned, longer this time. A faint crack traced across the wall near the ceiling beam, thin as a hairline fracture but spreading a fraction of an inch farther with each pulse. Ranger barked once, sharp and urgent, then planted himself even more firmly over the opening. "You're not in charge," Ethan said quietly, though his voice carried no anger. He moved toward the gap. Ranger stepped sideways, blocking him fully now, chest pressing against Ethan's shin. The dog's amber eyes were intense, pleading without fear. Ethan hesitated. War had taught him to trust patterns, to trust signals beyond sight. Ranger had never misread danger. Not once. Another vibration surged upward. This time the table rattled slightly. Dust drifted from the rafters. Ethan exhaled slowly and crouched beside Ranger. He placed a hand along the dog's neck, feeling the tension in the muscles beneath the thick fur. "If we don't see what's changing," he said softly, "we can't stop it." Ranger held his ground for 3 seconds longer, then reluctantly stepped aside, though he did not retreat far. Ethan lowered himself into the tunnel again, flashlight in hand. The air felt different immediately. Colder, denser. The carved walls seemed to carry faint echoes before he even reached the cavern. When he entered the quartz chamber, the transformation was undeniable. A new fracture split the ceiling directly above the heavily drilled section. It was not merely a surface crack. It ran deep, a jagged line radiating outward like lightning frozen in stone. Fine dust filtered down from its edges. He moved cautiously toward the drilled wall. The cavity behind the quartz cluster pulsed faintly with each tremor, not collapsing but expanding in subtle increments. He angled the flashlight into the deepest drilled hole again. The beam disappeared into darkness as before, but now the darkness seemed larger. Then he saw it. A section of the quartz layer had shifted outward by nearly 2 inches, creating a narrow vertical slit. Through it, beyond the glittering crystal edges, lay something that absorbed light entirely. It was not reflective mineral. It was not packed earth. It was empty space, a void that extended far beyond the limits of the quartz chamber. The tremor returned, stronger now. The vertical slit widened slightly with a brittle crack. From within the darkness came a sound unlike the others. Not a collapse, not drilling. A slow, resonant inhale of stone, adjusting under redistributed weight. Ethan stepped back instinctively. The sensation was deeply wrong, not violent, but alive in its own geological rhythm. He swept the beam across the chamber floor and noticed something new. Near the collapsed support beams on the far side, a section of ground had dropped by a fraction of an inch, creating a subtle tilt. A loose rock rolled slightly, then stopped. Above him, a faint metallic echo filtered down the tunnel, drilling, distant, but persistent. Hale's team had resumed. Ethan's jaw tightened. They were not drilling the primary quartz wall. They were drilling deeper. Perhaps beneath the secondary cavity Sarah had described. The beam of his flashlight trembled slightly as another vibration rolled through the chamber. The fracture in the ceiling extended another inch. Fine shards of crystal fell like glass rain, shattering against the stone below. Ranger suddenly appeared at the tunnel entrance, having followed him despite his earlier reluctance. The dog barked again, louder now, urgency replacing restraint. "I see it," Ethan said quietly. He angled the beam once more through the widening slit. The darkness beyond seemed endless. He could not see a floor. He could not see a ceiling. Only depth. A memory surfaced unbidden. Margaret standing in this cavern decades earlier, realizing what lay beneath the quartz, choosing to seal access rather than exploit it. Another pulse. The floor beneath Ethan's boots shifted noticeably. This was no longer a matter of valuable crystals. The secondary void was not passive. It redistributed load with each alteration above it. Every drill penetration changed the internal balance. The rhythmic metallic echo grew louder. Ethan turned and began moving back toward the tunnel. Ranger kept pace beside him, glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting the chamber to follow them upward. Halfway up the incline, the tremor intensified sharply. Ethan braced himself against the carved wall. A deep, resonant crack thundered through the cavern below. Not a localized break, a structural shift. He reached the cabin floor just as a violent shudder rippled through the boards. The stove door flew open, scattering embers across the stone hearth. A glass tumbler slid from the table and shattered. Ranger sprinted toward the front door, barking furiously now. Ethan grabbed the notebook Margaret had left behind and shoved it into his jacket pocket. The tremor subsided, but did not fully cease. It lingered like a heartbeat under stress. Through the window, he could see faint dust rising from the tree line, where Hale's hidden path descended. They had pierced something deeper, and whatever lay beneath the quartz was not stable anymore. The cabin floor gave a faint but audible groan, wood straining against shifting load. Ethan knelt briefly and pressed his palm against the boards. He felt the vibration clearly now. Not random. Cyclical. The void below was adjusting, expanding, not collapsing yet, but changing. And something about the sound of that change carried a warning older than machinery. This was not a mine resisting intrusion. It was a structure reacting to damage. Ranger returned to his side, breathing hard but steady, eyes locked on Ethan as if waiting for the next command. Ethan rose slowly. If they drilled any further, the fracture above the quartz would connect with the expanding void beneath it. And when that happened, the cliff would not simply crack. It would shear from within. Something below did not want to be disturbed, and they had already disturbed it. The floor vibrated again. Deeper this time. Not wind, not settling rock, but the sound of a hollow space changing shape. And it was growing. The vibration did not fade with the night. It deepened. By dawn, the cliff carried a low, constant tremor beneath the surface, subtle but relentless. Ethan had not slept. Ranger had not closed his eyes once. The air felt charged, like the seconds before artillery impacts when the ground remembered what was coming before the soldiers did. Ethan stood near the cabin window, flannel jacket still on, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the distant tree line where faint metallic echoes rose and fell in steady rhythm. Hale's crew had not left. They had recalibrated. The drilling now came in controlled intervals, not frantic bursts. They were targeting something specific. Mercer arrived shortly after sunrise, his heavy truck tires crunching over gravel. He stepped out before the engine fully died, beard damp with morning mist, eyes darker than the day before. Behind him, Sarah climbed out more slowly, her ash-blonde hair pulled back tightly now, glasses replaced with contact lenses, as if she expected to move quickly. "They changed angle," she said before even reaching the porch. "The frequency is lower. They're drilling beneath the secondary cavity." Ethan nodded once. They found the base. Mercer swore under his breath. If they puncture that lower chamber, they won't just fracture the quartz, Sarah finished. They'll destabilize the entire load distribution. A sharper tremor interrupted her. The cabin floor shuddered hard enough to rattle the stovepipe. Ranger barked and sprinted toward the tunnel opening. Ethan did not hesitate this time. He grabbed a coil of rope from the supply crate, a headlamp, and moved. "Ethan, wait," Sarah called. But he was already lowering himself down. The tunnel felt alive with vibration. Dust filtered from the carved walls. Ranger raced ahead into the quartz chamber, paws slipping slightly, as the floor shifted under stress. The metallic drilling sound was no longer faint. It echoed through the rock like a pulse inside a skull. The cavern had changed overnight. The fracture in the ceiling had widened visibly, extending outward in branching lines. Fine crystal shards littered the floor. The vertical slit in the quartz wall was now wide enough to fit a forearm through. Beyond it, the darkness was immense. Ranger suddenly veered left, away from the primary fracture. He ran toward the far side, where collapsed wooden supports lay. He began pawing frantically at a specific section of ground, claws scraping against loose gravel and fractured stone. He barked sharply, then dug harder. Ethan rushed toward him. "What is it?" The answer came in the form of a violent tremor. The floor beneath Ethan's right boot gave way without warning. There was no time to brace. The ground vanished. He dropped through fractured rock and dust, the flashlight spinning away as darkness swallowed him. His shoulder struck stone first, then his back. Air blasted from his lungs. The fall was not long, but it was enough. A heavy slab of rock shifted above him and crashed down, pinning his lower leg beneath its weight. Silence followed, thick and absolute. For several seconds he could not breathe. Pain radiated from his ankle upward, sharp and immediate. He forced air back into his lungs and tried to move. His right leg refused. Above him, faint light filtered through the newly opened hole. Dust drifted in slow spirals. Then came the sound. Ranger's bark, closer than before, frantic now. "Ranger," Ethan rasped. The dog appeared at the edge of the collapse, outlined against the dim glow from above. His ears were pinned back, eyes wide, body trembling not from fear but urgency. He leaped down the fractured slope toward Ethan, claws scraping stone. He circled once, assessing. Then he began digging at the rock, pinning Ethan's leg. The slab did not budge. Another tremor rippled through the cavity. This lower chamber was different from the quartz cavern above. The air felt heavier, colder. The darkness here was deeper, swallowing even the faint glow from the headlamp Ethan fumbled to switch on. When the beam flickered alive, it revealed something staggering. He was in the secondary void. The walls were not lined with quartz. They were raw stone, smooth in places from natural compression, layered like sediment pressed under unimaginable weight. The ceiling arched high above, disappearing into shadow. The rock surface bore faint, organic curves, as though the chamber had formed slowly over centuries, adjusting to pressure like a lung expanding and contracting. Ranger dug harder, claws striking stone with desperate rhythm. He shifted to another angle, biting at smaller rocks, dragging them away piece by piece. Ethan gritted his teeth and tried to lift the slab. It did not move. Pain shot through his leg. He felt warmth spreading inside his boot. Blood. The drilling sound above grew louder. Hale's crew had not stopped. If anything, they had accelerated. "Stop," Ethan whispered under his breath. Not to Ranger, but to the men above. They could not hear him. Another violent shift shook the void. The chamber responded like a living structure redistributing stress. A crack spidered across the ceiling far above. Pebbles rained down. Ranger paused only long enough to glance at Ethan's face. Then he resumed digging, this time attacking the edge of the slab where it met the floor. His claws tore at his own skin. Dust coated his muzzle. He whined once but did not retreat. Ethan's breathing slowed deliberately. Panic would waste oxygen. He had been trapped before, though never like this. In a different desert, under different rubble. He remembered the wait, the silence, the waiting for rescue that might not come. He was not the rescuer now. He was the one pinned beneath stone. "Easy," he murmured to Ranger, voice shaking despite control. "Not your fault." But Ranger did not slow. He dug until small stones shifted. One wedge of rock slid free. The pressure on Ethan's ankle lessened slightly. Not enough. Another tremor, this one sharper. A section of the ceiling cracked audibly. The drilling above faltered momentarily, then resumed. They did not know what they were doing. Ethan reached for the rope at his belt, tying one end around Ranger's harness. His hands trembled. "Go," he whispered, pointing upward. "Find them." Ranger stared at him, torn between command and instinct. "Go." Ethan forced the word. The dog hesitated for one heartbeat, then scrambled up the fractured slope, disappearing through the collapse hole. Alone now, Ethan listened to the void breathing around him. The cyclical vibration had intensified. The lower chamber was expanding incrementally under redistributed weight. If Hale's drill breached the wrong section, the void would lose equilibrium entirely. Dust filtered down again. The crack overhead widened. Footsteps above. Voices shouting. The drilling stopped abruptly. Then Ranger's bark echoed down the tunnel, furious and relentless. A new sound followed. Rock shifting from above, as someone moved toward the collapse site. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the raw truth of it. He could die here. Not in war, not in some distant conflict, but beneath his grandmother's cabin, pinned in a void no one understood. Light flared above as someone shone a lamp downward. A silhouette appeared at the edge of the collapse. Mercer's voice carried first. "Ethan." Sarah's voice followed, tight with urgency. "He's below the secondary cavity." Ranger barked again, right at the edge, as if guiding them precisely where to dig. Ethan exhaled slowly. For the first time in this story, he was not the one descending into danger. He was the one waiting to be pulled out of it. Darkness pressed against Ethan like weight made visible. He could hear the void breathing, the deep rhythmic contraction of rock redistributing stress above and below him. Dust drifted through the narrow beam of his headlamp. His right leg remained pinned beneath the slab, numb now from pressure, but alive with a dull, spreading ache. He forced himself not to look at it. Panic narrowed thought. Thought had to stay wide. Above, Ranger's barking had shifted from frantic to ferocious. The dog's voice echoed down the fractured shaft, raw and hoarse, but relentless. Then came the sound of boots scraping rock. Mercer's voice again, urgent and closer now. "Ethan, stay with me." Another tremor rolled through the chamber. The ceiling groaned, a low, resonant complaint. A crack shot across the upper vault, splitting in two directions. Ethan braced for collapse. Above ground, events were unfolding faster than anyone anticipated. Hale's crew had continued drilling for several minutes after Ranger's first warning bark. They had believed the tremor to be superficial settling. Victor Hale stood near the drilling rig, jaw set, watching the angle of the bore with sharp calculation. He did not raise his voice. He never did. His leadership style was controlled, almost clinical, shaped by years in corporate extraction sites, where risk was weighed against profit rather than fear. Beside him, the heavy-set man with the neck tattoo adjusted the drill pressure impatiently. "We're close," he muttered. "You feel that change in resistance?" The younger man hovered several steps back, eyes darting between the ground and the trees. His name was Lucas Grady, 29, formerly an apprentice electrician who had joined Hale's operation after losing steady work when a plant closure gutted his hometown. He was not hardened like the others. His restlessness was not aggression but uncertainty, disguised as loyalty. The ground shifted abruptly beneath them. Not violently, but enough for Lucas to stagger. He looked down and saw the soil ripple slightly, as if something underneath had inhaled. "Victor," he said, voice tight. "It's not settling. It's sinking." Hale frowned. Before he could answer, a sharp crack split the earth near the drilling base. A section of rock dropped by several inches. The heavy-set man cursed and jumped backward, but Lucas was too slow. The ground beneath his left foot gave way entirely, and he fell into a shallow depression created by the collapsing surface. His leg twisted beneath him, pinned awkwardly under a slab of fractured stone. He screamed once, shock overtaking pride. The drilling machine toppled sideways and went silent. Ranger heard it. The dog's bark cut off mid-echo. For a fraction of a second, he stood frozen at the edge of the collapse hole leading down to Ethan. His entire body trembled with decision. Ethan was below, injured, alone. Then came Lucas's second cry from the surface above. Ranger turned. In that single moment, instinct collided with loyalty. He could stay beside Ethan, digging until his paws tore open entirely. Or he could run toward the new sound of pain above. He ran upward. Mercer saw the dog burst from the collapse opening and sprint past him toward Hale's camp. "Where are you going?" Mercer shouted. But Ranger did not slow. Sarah reached the surface just in time to see the heavy-set man trying unsuccessfully to lift the slab pinning Lucas. Hale stood still, eyes calculating fracture lines spreading outward. Ranger launched himself at the slab without hesitation. He dug at the edges, teeth scraping stone, claws tearing. Lucas, pale and shaking, stared at the dog in disbelief. "Get him off me," he gasped. Hale moved finally, kneeling beside Lucas. Up close, the calm in his expression cracked slightly. He had seen collapse before, but not this pattern. The ground around them was not merely unstable. It was shifting in concentric stress waves. Ranger's claws bled openly now, crimson staining the dust. He did not retreat. He wedged his body between the slab and Lucas's trapped leg, pushing with all his weight. Mercer reached them seconds later and added his strength. Together they managed to shift the rock enough for Lucas to pull free. Another violent tremor struck. The earth split open farther along the cliff edge. A jagged line ran toward the cabin foundation. Hale looked at the fracture, and something finally changed in his eyes. Calculation gave way to comprehension. "This isn't about the quartz," he said under his breath. Sarah stepped forward, breathless. "It's the secondary cavity. It's redistributing load into the lower void. If you breach it again, the entire shear line will cascade." Hale looked at her sharply. "You're certain?" She met his gaze without flinching. "I modeled it twice. The lower void is carrying the cliff's spine." Another crack thundered from below. A deep roar followed, as if an immense hollow space had shifted. Ethan heard it from beneath and felt the ceiling above him vibrate violently. A chunk of rock fell inches from his shoulder. For a split second he believed the entire chamber would collapse inward. Then something changed. The drilling had stopped. Footsteps pounded back toward the collapse site. Voices overlapped in urgency. A beam of light pierced the darkness above Ethan once more. Mercer's face appeared at the edge, followed by Hale's angular silhouette. "Hold on," Mercer shouted. Hale crouched and looked down into the secondary void, eyes scanning the geometry of stress fractures along the walls. He inhaled sharply. Even he could see it now. The chamber was not random. It was architectural, formed by centuries of compressed sediment redistributing force evenly. The quartz above had acted like a buffer. Their drilling had compromised the buffer, forcing pressure downward. "That's not a mine," Hale muttered. "It's a support chamber." Sarah's voice came from behind him. "It's the load-bearing lung. If it collapses, the entire cliff shears from inside." Ranger barked again, standing at Hale's side, gaze fixed downward toward Ethan. For a brief, charged moment, Hale hesitated. Years of ambition warred against the evidence in front of him. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Kill the operation," he ordered. Now. The heavy-set man ran to shut down remaining equipment. Hale grabbed a rope and lowered himself partially into the collapse opening. Mercer secured the line while Sarah guided from above. They began shifting rock carefully, working in coordinated motion. Ethan's vision blurred as exhaustion crept in. He felt the slab over his leg move slightly. Pain surged, sharp and immediate. He clenched his jaw but did not cry out. "Almost there," Mercer called. With a final coordinated pull, the slab shifted enough for Hale to wedge a metal bar beneath it. Mercer lifted. Ethan dragged his leg free, just as a deafening crack exploded through the lower chamber. They hauled him upward, hands gripping arms and shoulders. Ranger barked in frantic relief as Ethan emerged into the light. Behind them, a section of the quartz chamber ceiling collapsed entirely, crashing downward into the secondary void. Dust erupted upward in a violent plume. Through the settling debris, a massive cavity became visible below. Not small, not incidental. A vast hollow extending deep beneath the cliff, its curved walls bearing the weight of everything above. Everyone stared. If they had drilled a few feet deeper, they would have pierced that cavity fully. And when that happened, the cliff would not have cracked. It would have broken from within. By mid-morning, the sound of sirens climbed the narrow road, carved into the cliff. The mountain no longer trembled violently, but it carried a fragile stillness, like a body that had survived shock and was now conserving energy. Dust lingered in the air, drifting in thin veils across the clearing. The drilling rig lay overturned, cables severed, its metallic ambition reduced to twisted silence. 2 sheriff vehicles arrived first, tires crunching cautiously over gravel. Sheriff Raymond Cole stepped out of the lead cruiser. He was a broad man in his late 50s with a weathered face, carved by decades of high-altitude sun and hard decisions. His hair, once dark, had faded into silver along the sides, and a trimmed mustache framed a mouth accustomed to speaking plainly. Raymond had known Margaret Brooks personally. He had once hiked the lower ridge with her during a wildfire evacuation years earlier. She had refused to leave until every resident had been accounted for. That memory still colored the way he approached this land. He surveyed the fractured earth and the dust plume rising from the exposed cavity below. "Nobody move," he said firmly, though no one was attempting to. His voice carried authority without aggression. "This whole face is unstable." Behind him arrived 2 county geotechnical officers and a representative from the State Geological Survey, a younger man named Dr. Aaron Patel. Aaron was in his early 30s, slim build, dark hair, neatly combed, rectangular glasses catching the sunlight. His posture carried both nervous energy and sharp intelligence. He had built his reputation modeling seismic anomalies in mountain formations. And when he saw the open cavity beneath the quartz collapse, his eyes widened not with greed, but awe. "This isn't a standard void," Aaron murmured as he crouched near the fracture line. "It's a compression chamber. It redistributes vertical load laterally before it reaches the cliff edge." Sarah nodded quietly beside him. Her ash-blonde hair had come loose from its tie, strands falling across her face, but she did not bother brushing them aside. "That's what I tried to explain," she said. "It's layered, a void beneath a buffer." They nearly punctured the load core. Hale stood several steps back, arms folded tightly across his chest. The scar at his temple seemed sharper in the daylight. He did not argue. He did not defend. The weight of what they had almost caused hung visibly over him. Lucas sat on the tailgate of a truck, ankle-wrapped and face pale, staring at the ground as if replaying the moment he fell. The heavy-set man with the neck tattoo avoided eye contact entirely. Sheriff Cole turned toward Ethan, who sat on a folding chair near the cabin porch, his injured leg braced and elevated. The forest green and black plaid flannel jacket was streaked with dust and dried blood. Ranger lay at his feet, front paws bandaged carefully by Sarah's steady hands. The dog's amber eyes remained alert, though exhaustion pulled at the edges of his focus. "You could press charges," Raymond said quietly. "Trespassing. Illegal drilling. Endangerment." Ethan looked at the exposed cavity beyond the shattered quartz ceiling. Sunlight filtered down into it, illuminating the immense hollow space that had supported the cliff for centuries. "That won't change what almost happened," he replied. Dr. Patel stood and addressed the group. "This area will be immediately restricted. The state will classify it as a protected geological structure. No commercial extraction permitted. The internal cavity is too integral to the cliff's stability." Mercer exhaled slowly, as though releasing years of unfinished anger. "So that's it," he said. "For now," Aaron answered. Further drilling could have triggered a shear failure extending miles. Hale finally stepped forward. "He warned us," he admitted, nodding toward Ethan. "And the dog." His voice carried no irony, only recognition. Sheriff Cole glanced at Ranger, who lifted his head slightly at the attention. "Sometimes," Raymond said, "the only ones listening are the ones who don't speak." Later that afternoon, investigators documented equipment, took statements, and marked the perimeter with bright warning tape. Reporters did not arrive. The road was too remote, and the state preferred discretion. Sarah approached Ethan as the officials worked. "You understand," she said quietly. "If you disclose the crystal value, private investors would swarm this place. You'd have legal battles for years." Ethan pulled Margaret's notebook from his jacket pocket. The final intact line lingered in his mind. "I chose wrong once. Don't let you have to fix it for me." He traced the indentation where pages had been torn out decades earlier. Perhaps Margaret had once considered exploiting the quartz. Perhaps she had stood at the same edge of decision he faced now. He looked toward the cavity one last time. "It's not a mine," he said softly. "It's a spine." Sarah nodded once, understanding passing between them, without further explanation. When Sheriff Cole returned with official paperwork, Ethan signed only the statement regarding structural hazard. He did not mention crystal volume. He did not mention estimated extraction value. He described the fractures, the risk, the void beneath. Nothing more. Hale watched him sign. "You could have walked away wealthy," Hale said quietly. Ethan met his gaze evenly. "I walked away alive." That evening, as the last vehicle descended the cliff road and silence reclaimed the clearing, the cabin stood once more against the edge of open sky. Temporary braces supported the compromised floor section. The exposed cavity below was now covered with reinforced mesh to prevent further collapse. Ethan lowered himself carefully onto the porch steps. Ranger settled beside him, head resting lightly against Ethan's knee. The dog's paws bore thin scars beneath the bandages, reminders of the night he chose action over hesitation. The air was calm again. Pine branches swayed gently. The cliff did not tremble. Ethan looked out over the vast drop beyond the porch. He did not feel like a man who had lost an opportunity. He felt like a man who had finally understood the difference between possession and stewardship. Margaret had not guarded treasure. She had guarded equilibrium. The quartz would remain buried behind fractured stone. The lower void would continue its silent work, redistributing weight, breathing pressure in slow geological rhythms. No one would own it. No one would sell it. And perhaps that was the point. Ranger lifted his head and looked up at Ethan, eyes steady, waiting as always for the next command. Ethan smiled faintly and ran a hand along the dog's neck. "We leave it," he said quietly. The mountain did not answer. It did not need to. The cliff still stands. The cabin still rests against the edge of open sky. And beneath it, the hidden chamber continues to carry the weight no one can see. Ethan did not walk away rich. He walked away awake. He learned that not every discovery is meant to be claimed, and not every treasure is meant to be taken. Some things are placed in our path not to test our ambition, but to test our character. When one man chose restraint over profit, and when a loyal dog chose courage over fear, a community was spared from disaster. In a world that often rewards taking, this story reminds us that true strength sometimes lies in leaving something untouched. Perhaps that is how miracles quietly happen, not through thunder, but through small decisions guided by wisdom. Maybe God does not always move mountains. Sometimes, He places the right people beside them. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment about what you would have chosen. Subscribe and be part of this journey. May God bless you, protect your home, and strengthen your heart in every quiet decision you make.